John F. Kennedy was a charismatic and passionate liberal. He was the youngest to ever be elected into office. On November 22nd, 1963, JFK was assassinated as his motorcade drove through Dallas, becoming also the youngest president to die. Without JFK's ordered naval blockade to Cuba, a nuclear war may have happened. By his firmness with Khrushchev, the two superpowers reached a peaceful resolution. Without JFK and his speech to Congress, the goal of sending a man to the moon may have not occurred for years. Lastly, without JFK, the Peace Corps would not exist, which had served in 139 countries to educate about AIDS and economic development. As a fellow liberal and fan of JFK, I have studied about him and his years in office. I understand the importance of his contributions as president, though short-lived, and the crises he's faced during the fear of communism in the United States. Today, I would like to discuss the life of John F. Kennedy. We will discuss his rise to presidency, the crises he's faced, and his accomplishments, and his assassination during his third year. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born May 29, 1917, to Rose and Joseph Kennedy. John was the second oldest of 9 children, 4 boys and 5 girls, and from a young age became known as Jack. Jack was a very unhealthy baby and suffered from many childhood illnesses such as whooping cough, measles, and chickenpox. Before the age of 3, Jack became ill with scarlet fever. Joseph Kennedy Sr., afraid he may lose his son, visited him every day in the hospital. A little after a month, Jack started to recover and gained his health back. But even so, Jack was never a healthy child. When Jack was 3, the family moved to a neighborhood outside of Boston. Joseph Sr. was a hardworking Irish Catholic businessman during a time in Boston where Irish Catholics were prejudiced against. Despite the prejudice, Jack's grandfathers both became prominent politicians, and Jack's father became very wealthy. During adolescence, Jack attended Choate boarding school for boys. After he graduated, he attended Harvard University, where he played football with his older brother Joe. Joe was the one in the family to announce since they were young he would become the first Catholic president, and everyone believed it. Jack, though intelligent, his grades were only average and was more involved with school clubs and sports. When Joseph Sr. was appointed United States Ambassador for England, the family relocated except for Joe and Jack, who were still attending school. After summer visits in England, Jack became more interested in foreign affairs and started to study them more in Harvard. After graduation, Joe and Jack enlisted in the Navy during World War II. Joe was a flyer and sent to Europe, and Jack was made lieutenant and assigned to be the commander of a patrol torpedo boat, the PT-109 in the South Pacific, according to John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. August 2, 1943, while patrolling for enemy ships, a Japanese destroyer came straight for the boat. Lieutenant Kennedy swerved, but the destroyer ran the PT-109, splitting it in half and killing 2 men. The others jumped off as it went up into flames. Kennedy was slammed hard against the cockpit and injured his back that was already weakened by football years before. Patrick McMahon was also still left in the boat, burned and ready to give up. Lieutenant Kennedy managed to haul him to where the other survivors were clinging to a piece of the boat, and spotting an island, Lieutenant Kennedy dragged McMahon ashore by a strap attached to McMahon's life jacket between his teeth. 6 days later, they were discovered by natives and eventually rescued. Jack was awarded the Navy Marine Corps Medal for his leadership and courage. With the war ending, Jack was deciding on his career of either becoming a teacher or a writer, but upon hearing his oldest brother Joe died when his plane blew up during a mission in England, his father talked him into running for Congress in Massachusetts' 11th Congressional District, which he won in 1946. John F. Kennedy, a Democrat, served 3 terms in the House of Representatives, and in 1952 he was elected to the U.S. Senate. Soon after being elected, Jack married 24-year-old Jacqueline Bouvier, a writer at the Washington Times-Herald. Shortly after, Jack went through 2 operations for his back, and while recovering wrote Profiles in Courage, a book about senators risking their careers for what they believed in, which received a Pulitzer Prize in 1947. In 1946, Jack was almost picked to run for vice president. When he wasn't, he decided he would run for president in the next election and started traveling and campaigning. On July 13, 1960, the Democratic Party nominated him as their candidate, and Jack asked Texas Senator Lyndon B. Johnson to be the vice president. Jack would win against Republican candidate Richard Nixon by a small margin, and at 43 he became the youngest president. John F. Kennedy was sworn in as the 31st president on January 20th, 1961, where he made the famous inaugural speech, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Kennedy, his wife, and 2 children became American royalty known to the public as Camelot. One of the first things President Kennedy did was create the Peace Corps. Through this program, which still exists today, Americans can volunteer to work anywhere in the world where assistance is needed. But despite living in Camelot, tensions were rising between the United States and the communist regime of the Soviet Union. Though no fighting had taken place, the 2 superpowers were in the possibility of nuclear war, and Jack knew if that were to happen, millions of people were to die. After shortly taking office, Jack was made aware of a planned attack against Fidel Castro, a communist who had taken over Cuba's government. The United States were to train Cuban rebels to invade and attack Castro's regime. The rebels were ambushed and killed or taken prisoners within 24 hours, and they surrendered. President Kennedy had to make a deal with Castro, trading $53 million worth of food and supplies to Cubans in order to get the prisoners released. In 1962, an American U-2 plane took pictures of Soviet missiles in Cuba. Fearing that it could be a potential attack on the United States since Florida was 90 miles away, Kennedy ordered a naval blockade to keep Soviet ships from leaving. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, and President Kennedy made an agreement to remove the missiles if the blockade was disbanded. The world has never been so close to nuclear war since or before then. The president has also made many speeches on the space race against Russia and asked Congress to approve a $22 billion for Project Apollo, which will send a man to the moon before the end of the decade, which would happen in 1969 with Neil Armstrong. President Kennedy arrived in Dallas with wife Jackie to give several speeches in November 22, 1963. While driving in his motorcade amongst cheering crowds, President Kennedy was shot and died shortly after. The whole assassination was caught on film by Abraham Zapruder. Lee Harvey Oswald was charged with assassination hours later. On November 24th, while escorting Oswald out of the police department, Jack Ruby, a man in the crowd of press, shot and killed Oswald, silencing the only man who knew what would really happen, according to John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. Learning about John F. Kennedy's life, presidency, and assassination tells us what he contributed to and is still around today. His brief time in office stands out in people's memories for his leadership and accomplishments. Many respect his coolness when faced with Soviet Union and the fear of communism. Others admire his ability to inspire people with his speeches. He was once in a lifetime man that was cut down in his prime. Imagine if Kennedy was not there to stop the Cuban Missile Crisis. Would nuclear war have happened? If he was there, he would not be to create the Peace Corps when the countries in need to recognize us like they do today. If Kennedy did not promote the space race, would it have been Russia on the moon first and not Neil Armstrong? I hope you see this man accomplishes more in those short years in office than most full-term presidents. As John Fitzgerald Kennedy said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country."